Radar Picket Station Number 1, 60 miles northwest of Okinawa. The afternoon of the 6th of April, 1945. The destroyer USS Bush had been sitting alone on that patch of open water for days. Alone was the job. Stations were drawn on the chart around the island like numbers on a clock face, and a destroyer sat on each one with her radar switched on and radiating, which meant she was the first thing the Japanese would see. That was intended. See them first. Call the fighters. Stay. At about 2 o'clock, aircraft began appearing on the screen. 40 of them, spread from 500 feet to 20,000. The Bush shot at least one down. Her 5-inch guns were firing the most advanced ammunition manufactured anywhere on Earth. Shells that carried a small radio in the nose listened for their own echo and decided on their own when to explode. They did not have to hit. That was the entire point. They had never had to hit. At 3:15, an aircraft came in low across the water and struck her on the starboard side at deck level, between the number 1 and number 2 stacks. Its bomb detonated in the forward engine room. She lay stopped, without power, but afloat. Tugs were requested. Nobody yet believed she was going to die. The destroyer, Colquhoun, turned and ran for her, because that was what picket ships did. When the station next door was in trouble, you went. Colquhoun took 4 kamikaze hits, closing the distance. She was wrecked so completely that American forces had to sink her themselves. At 5:25, a second aircraft hit the Bush on the port side, between the stacks, and nearly cut the ship in half. At 5:45, a third. Her ammunition began to cook off. An ocean swell finished her. 87 of her crew went down with the ship. That destroyer was carrying the closest thing to a miracle that American science produced in the Second World War. A secret guarded as tightly as the atomic bomb. And harder to guard because there was no fence you could put around it. It was fired by the 1,000 in front of the enemy every single day. It cost roughly $1 billion. More than 100,000 Americans built it, and almost none of them were ever told what it was. And on the 6th of April, 1945, at Radar Picket Station Number 1, it did not save a single man aboard the USS Bush. To understand why, and to understand what it did save, and what that cost, and why the men on the other side went to their graves, never once suspecting it existed, you have to go back 5 years. Back to a laboratory in Washington, D.C., that had been built to study the magnetic field of the Earth. In August of 1940, a committee was created inside Vannevar Bush's National Defense Research Committee and given a single letter for a name. Section T. Bush was 50 years old that summer. An engineer from Massachusetts, thin as a rail and dry as gunpowder, and he had just done something no American scientist had ever done. He had walked into the Oval Office with one sheet of paper and walked out with the authority to organize the scientific manpower of the United States for a war the country had not yet entered. Bush understood something most generals did not. The next war would not be won by the side with the most courage. It would be won by the side with the best mathematics. The mathematics in 1940 were terrible. The man he put in charge of Section T was Merle Tuve, 39 years old, a geophysicist born in Canton, South Dakota, to Norwegian immigrant stock. His father, a college president, his mother, a music teacher. He had grown up next door to Ernest Lawrence, who would go on to build the cyclotron. In the 1920s, Tuve had done something nobody had done before. He bounced pulsed radio waves off the upper atmosphere and measured how high the sky was. That work opened the road to radar. He was demanding, results-driven, and held the people around him to standards they sometimes resented. He ran his group out of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution, a quiet place built for the study of the planet's magnetic breathing. He was about to turn it into a weapons laboratory. Here is the problem, stated the way it was stated to him. A bomber flies at 10,000 feet at 250 miles an hour. The gun crew below fires a shell that takes 10 or 12 seconds to climb to that altitude. In 12 seconds, the bomber moves the better part of a mile. So, the gunner does not aim at the airplane. He aims at where the airplane is going to be, and he sets a mechanical timer in the nose to burst the shell at that instant. If the timer is off by 1/5 of 1 second, the shell explodes 300 feet away. The bomber flies on, untouched, unaware. The gunners had a phrase for what that felt like: throwing rocks at birds. Here is the number. Firing 5-inch shells with time fuses, the United States Navy expended, on average, over 500 rounds for every aircraft it brought down. 500 shells, each one weighing 55 pounds. A ship carried a few hundred rounds per gun. Do that arithmetic, and you arrive at the thing that kept Vannevar Bush awake. In a serious air attack, an American warship could empty every magazine she carried and shoot down almost nothing. The whole structure of naval air defense rested on a lie that the Navy quietly knew was a lie. And there was another number that not had arrived yet. In 5 years, off an island called Okinawa, hundreds of Japanese aircraft would come at the American fleet in a single organized wave, every one of them flown by a young man who had no intention of coming back. Against time fuses, that attack would have ended the campaign. The idea, when it came, was not American. In the late summer of 1940, a black metal deed box crossed the Atlantic with a British scientific mission led by Sir Henry Tizard. Britain was losing. Britain was alone. And Britain did something no nation at war had ever done: handed over every scientific secret it possessed for nothing to a country that was not yet a belligerent. The box held the cavity magnetron. It held jet engine research. It held the beginnings of the atomic bomb. And it held British work on a device called the proximity fuse. The Americans read it with great interest. Then they got to the conclusions, and their interest curdled. The British had already tried. They had built circuits. They had run tests. And they had concluded that the acceleration inside a gun barrel was simply too violent. 20,000 times the force of gravity. A vacuum tube in that environment did not break. It disintegrated. Their recommendation was that the thing might work someday in a rocket where the launch was gentler. That is what landed on Merle Tuve's desk. Not a solution. A file marked impossible with a foreign signature at the bottom. 20,000 G. Consider what that means. A man weighing 180 pounds at 20,000 G momentarily weighs 1,800 tons. Every wire, every solder joint, every speck of dust inside the glass becomes 20,000 times heavier than it was on the workbench. A wire the weight of an eyelash becomes a wire the weight of a hammer. This happens in about 0.002 of a second. Then the rifling grabs the shell and spins it. past 200 revolutions per second, and centrifugal force begins trying to throw every internal part sideways through the wall of the casing. And after all of that, the device has to wake up, transmit a continuous radio signal, listen for the echo off an airplane, read the Doppler shift in that echo, decide how close the target is, fire the detonator. All of it in a fraction of a second, in the nose of a shell that is passing an airplane at better than 1,000 feet per second. Tuve later described what they needed in 3 parts, and the plainness of the list is the measure of the problem. Miniature vacuum tubes rugged enough to survive being shot from a gun, a miniature battery rugged enough to do the same and supply power, and a safety device to keep the fuse inert until the shell was a safe distance from the men who fired it. 3 items, 4 years. One of the men who came into that work was Ralph Baldwin. He was an astronomer. He had spent his graduate years studying the surface of the moon, and he had no experience with ordnance whatsoever. He would spend the rest of the war on the fuse, and decades later he would write the fullest, honest account of it that exists, because he had noticed that almost nobody in America knew it had happened. The tube manufacturers received the strangest specification their industry had ever seen. Glass that could take a hammer blow. Internal elements braced and shortened and mounted so that acceleration pressed them together instead of tearing them apart. Potting compound poured inside so nothing could shift. A battery that would sit dead in a magazine for a year in tropical heat and come alive in the instant of firing. Some of them said it could not be done. More than 40 industrial and academic contractors were eventually pulled into the work. Sylvania made the miniature tubes. Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, National Carbon, and others took up production. There is a moment in every project that changes history where the thing is still absurd, where a reasonable man could stand up, point at the wreckage on the bench, and say, this is a waste of money and glass and time. On that day, on the evidence in front of him, he would be right. In August of 1942, 2 years in, the fuse went out onto the Chesapeake Bay for its trial. The light cruiser USS Cleveland, newly commissioned, and on her shakedown, was to shoot at radio-controlled drones over 2 days. The gunners brought down all 3 drones on the first day. 4 bursts. The drones were maneuvering. The Navy cancelled the rest of the test. They had seen enough. Production started immediately. By the end of that year, the factories were assembling about 500 fuses a day. The first shells reached the Pacific in the late fall of 1942. Commander William Parsons, the man who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay, carried the first 5,000 out himself and reported to Admiral Halsey. Halsey told him which ships were most likely to be attacked from the air. The fuses were split between the carriers Enterprise and Saratoga and the light cruiser Helena. Parsons went aboard the Helena to watch. On the morning of the 5th of January 1943, near Guadalcanal, a formation of American cruisers and destroyers was surprised by Aichi D-3A dive bombers, the type American sailors called VALs. The Japanese made their attack. One of them scored a hit on the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. Then they broke off and headed for home. And here is the truth of the moment, which is smaller and stranger than the legend. The Helena's gunners opened up on the VALs that were already leaving. It was almost an afterthought, a long-range salvo. Half conventional anti-aircraft shells, half the new ones. One of the departing valves came apart in the air and went into the sea. Nothing had hit it. A shell had merely passed close enough. Reports differ on how many rounds it took. 2 salvos, 3, 5. The accounts do not agree, and they never have. What is not in dispute is what the Helena's gunnery officer wrote afterward. He said, the value of the new projectile could not be stressed too highly. Nobody cheered. The gunners did not understand what they had just done. Most of them would go to their graves not knowing. They had been handed a special lot of ammunition, told to keep quiet, and given one rule that made no sense at all to a man standing in a gun tub at dawn. You may only fire these over water. Not over land, not over an island, not over anything a man could walk on afterward. The reason was simple, and it governed everything for the next 2 years. Perhaps 30% of these fuses were duds. A dud that lands in the sea sinks and is gone. A dud that lands in a rice paddy can be picked up. And the British had a hard memory on this point. They had recovered a German magnetic mine intact and reverse-engineered it. They knew exactly how fast a clever enemy could turn a windfall into a countermeasure. So, the fuse went to war in a cage. The Navy could use it over the Pacific. The Army, fighting across Europe with the same guns, could not. The most effective anti-aircraft round ever built sat in warehouses, while Vannevar Bush held the line on a cold calculation. Lose the secret, and you lose it forever. Keep it, and you spend it once. At the moment it matters most. The numbers vindicated him fast. During 1943, American ships fired about 9,000 rounds of 5-inch proximity ammunition and brought down 61 aircraft. 155 rounds per kill. Against 508 rounds per kill for time fuses in the same period. By the end of that year, proximity-fused rounds were only about a quarter of the anti-aircraft ammunition being fired, and they were accounting for more than half the aircraft shot down. 4,000 miles west, the other half of this story was assembling itself. By the autumn of 1944, the arithmetic of the Pacific War had become something Japanese staff officers could no longer discuss honestly in daylight. The carriers were sunk or empty. The veteran aviators, Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, were nearly all dead. The boys replacing them were leaving flight school with a fraction of the hours an American replacement pilot had. Send such a pilot against a Hellcat and he does not come back. Send him with a torpedo against a task force and he does not get within a mile of it. Bolt a bomb to the airframe, fuel him in one direction only, and he does not have to be good. He only has to hit. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi was 53 years old when he arrived in Manila on the 17th of October, 1944, to take command of the First Air Fleet. He was not a mystic. He was a naval aviator of the old school, a gambler, a drinker, a man who had once won a national mahjong tournament under a false name, and who had been thrown out of the Navy War College for slapping a geisha. He had clawed his way back on sheer expertise in naval air power. In 1934, he had written a memorandum arguing that Japan should scrap its battleships and build aircraft instead. In 1941, he had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack while telling his superiors that the war it started could not be won. And when suicide attack had been proposed earlier, Onishi had called it heresy. He arrived in the Philippines to find the first air fleet, on paper, a striking force, able to put fewer than 40 serviceable aircraft into the air. The American invasion fleet was already off Leyte. On the 19th of October, at Mabalacat Airfield, he put it to the officers of the 201st Air Group. There was, he said, only one way to make their meager strength count. Organize suicide units of Zero fighters carrying 250-kilogram bombs, each aircraft to crash into an enemy carrier. He asked them what they thought. The room was silent for a time. Then they agreed. He named it out of history. Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Divine Wind Special Attack Unit, after the typhoon that scattered a Mongol invasion fleet in 1281. A war Japan had won by weather and had spent 6 centuries telling itself it had won by destiny. The officer chosen to lead the first mission was Lieutenant Yukio Seki, 23 years old, a Naval Academy graduate, a dive bomber pilot of genuine skill. Married that spring. What Seki said before he flew has come down to us through a Japanese naval correspondent, and it has never sat comfortably in either country's version of this story. He is reported to have said that Japan's future was bleak if it was reduced to killing one of its best pilots, that he was not going for the emperor and not for the empire. He is reported to have said he was going because he had been ordered to. Whether those were his exact words and what else he said that morning depends on who is telling it. The account came out after the war and has been argued over ever since, which is itself the point. It is not the story of a fanatic. It is not the story of a hero. It is a young man who understood precisely what was being wasted. On the 25th of October, off Samar, aircraft of the Shikishima unit found the escort carriers of Taffy 3. The USS St. Lo was hit. The bomb went through the flight deck into the hangar, where armed and fueled aircraft were waiting. The fires reached the magazines. She sank in half an hour. 143 men died. Which pilot flew that aircraft has never been established. Whether Seki himself struck the St. Lo is not known, and the honest answer is that it does not matter. The outcome was the same, and the men who claimed to know were not in a position to. The first purpose-built suicide attack in naval history had cost Japan a handful of airplanes and sunk an American aircraft carrier. Now here is the part of the story that nobody wants. The fleet that day had proximity fuses. They did not save the St. Lo. The months that followed were the most effective the Kamikaze campaign would ever have, and they came after the United States Navy had been firing proximity fuses in combat for 21 months. The wonder weapon was already there. It was not enough yet. The reasons are not dramatic. In 1944, the fleet fired only about 32,000 proximity rounds. The supply was still limited, and not every magazine on every ship was full of them. Aircraft coming in, low, over the water, filled the radar picture with sea clutter and gave the gun directors seconds instead of minutes. And the directors themselves, the systems that actually told the gun where to point, were still being upgraded across the fleet, ship by ship. TUV's own laboratory was building a better one, the Mark 57, and it was not everywhere yet. The fuse made a near miss lethal. It did not tell the gun where to point, and there was a deeper thing which the men on the picket ships understood long before the admirals did. Every anti-aircraft doctrine ever written assumed a pilot who wanted to live. Every calculation of when he would break off, when he would jink, when he would drop and run, rested on that assumption. A pilot who has already decided to die does not break off. You can shoot him half to pieces, and he keeps coming because the airplane does not need to fly. It only needs to fall in the right place. The technology had arrived late to a problem it was never designed for. Meanwhile, in Germany, the same problem was being worked by men just as clever. German engineers had proximity fuse programs of their own. Their theoretical work was not behind. They understood the physics. They never fielded them in quantity. Not because their scientists were worse, because by 1944, the Reich could not mass-produce a device requiring millions of miniature tubes built to tolerances no factory had ever held. On assembly lines being bombed into gravel, with materials it no longer had, and a workforce it had shot, starved, or dragged in at gunpoint. The American fuse did not win because Americans were cleverer. It won because a country that was not being bombed could build 22 million of something, and a country that was being bombed could not. That is the secret. It was never a secret about physics. It was a secret about factories. And late in 1944, the cage door opened. The V1 came first. Proximity-fused shells went to the anti-aircraft guns, defending London and Antwerp, and the effect was decisive. Those batteries began erasing the flying bombs out of the sky at rates nobody had thought possible. Then, on the 16th of December, German armor came through the American line in freezing fog in the Ardennes. The weather grounded every Allied aircraft on the continent. Artillery was all that was left. Eisenhower knew about the fuse by then, and he insisted. The prohibition on firing it over land was lifted within 2 days. American gunners began bursting shells in the air above German infantry caught in the open, and the effect on troops who had spent 5 years learning to survive artillery by lying flat was something nothing in their experience had prepared them for. There was no ground burst to hide from. The shells went off overhead. Lying down did not help. The weapon, built to kill airplanes over the ocean, was spent at last on frozen ground in Belgium, and the fight it had actually been built for was 4 months away, forming on airfields in southern Kyushu. Vice Admiral Motomi Ugaki was 55 years old in the spring of 1945. He was formal, humorless, a career staff officer. He had been Yamamoto's chief of staff. He had been in the second aircraft over Bougainville the morning Sfonen Aran fighters shot Yamamoto out of the sky, and he had gone into the sea with the wreckage and lived, badly injured, carrying out of it the knowledge that he had watched his commander die and had been able to do nothing. Now he commanded the 5th Air Fleet from Kyushu, and his job was to send boys into the sea. The Americans landed on Okinawa on the 1st of April. Okinawa was not another island. Okinawa was a Japanese prefecture, home soil. The fleet lying off its beaches sat 150 miles from Kyushu itself. On that same 1st of April, Imperial General Headquarters ordered the conversion of all Army and Navy warplanes to special attack aircraft. Ugaki had gathered some 3,000 aircraft across Kyushu, everything that would fly: trainers, floatplanes, scouts. The operation was called Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. The name came from the war banner of Kusunoki Masashige, a 14th century warrior who went into a battle he knew he could not win on an emperor's orders, and killed himself at the end of it. They named the operation after a man famous for obeying an order that killed him. Kikusui No. 1 went out on the 6th of April. The numbers depend on who counted. American accounts put it at roughly 355 kamikaze aircraft, with about 340 escorts and conventional strike planes, near 700 in all. Japanese records for that day count 391 Navy aircraft and 133 Army aircraft dispatched, of which 215 Navy and 82 Army machines were the suicide attackers, just under 300. The two sides never reconciled their arithmetic. They agree it was the largest coordinated kamikaze attack of the war. It did not last 30 seconds. The assault began around 3 in the afternoon and ran for about 5 hours, and the first Kikusui operation as a whole was not finished until the 11th of April. American codebreakers knew it was coming. Every fighter in the 5th Fleet was in the air. The combat air patrols shot down roughly 200 of them before they reached the ships. Anti-aircraft fire took down about 200 more. Roughly 180 got through, and 60 miles out in front of the fleet, in a ring drawn on a chart, sat the destroyers. By April of 1945, everything the men at Section T had spent 4.5 years building was finally completely in place. The fuse was in the magazines, the directors were upgraded, the crews were veterans, the rationing was over. Out on the picket stations, it was not enough, because the mathematics that saved the fleet did not work out there, and the reason is the coldest thing in this story. A carrier task force is a circle of 90 ships. An aircraft attacking it flies into overlapping fire from dozens of batteries at once, and every one of those batteries is throwing shells that no longer need to hit. That is the dome. That is what 4.5 years bought. A picket destroyer is one ship, alone, on a flat sea, with 5 guns. 40 aircraft come at her at once from every point of the compass. She shoots one down, she shoots another down. The fuse does exactly what Merle Tuve promised. Every time, and it does not matter. Because there were 40 of them and she had 5 guns, and the ones she does not kill do not miss. The Japanese pilots had been ordered to find the carriers and the battleships. Most of them were too inexperienced to do it, and attacked the first thing they saw instead. The first thing they saw was always the picket line. Bush and Colquhoun both went down on the 6th of April. The first destroyers lost to kamikazes off Okinawa. Between them, they lost 129 men killed and 53 wounded. The Shipsen kept their numbers. The ships in them kept changing. By the end of the campaign, more than 4,900 American sailors were dead or missing off Okinawa, and nearly the same number wounded. 32 ships and craft had been sunk, 368 damaged. It was the heaviest loss the United States Navy suffered in any naval campaign of the war. A great many of those men died out on the picket stations, in the dark, 6 miles from anyone. Here is the thing that should be said plainly. The proximity fuse worked. The Kikusui attacks did not sink one heavy Allied ship, not one carrier, not one battleship. The dome held. It held because the picket ships were out there absorbing the blow. That is what a technological miracle looks like from the inside. It does not look like a wall of steel that nothing can penetrate. It looks like a probability curve. and a probability curve does not care where you happen to be standing when it fails. Now hold the other half of this up to the light. Ugaki launched 9 more Kikusui operations through June, each smaller than the last, each fed by boys with fewer hours than the boys before them. His pilots reported American gunfire of impossible accuracy, shells bursting where an aircraft was about to be, rather than where it had been. He never knew why. The Japanese recovered dud American shells throughout the war. They opened them. They found small glass tubes and batteries inside, and their engineers concluded that no vacuum tube could survive being fired from a gun, which is word for word what the British had concluded in 1940. The difference is that somebody made the Americans look again. So the Japanese wrote it off. A timer, a safety device, something. And they went on attributing American gunnery to radar, to fire control, to training, to luck. They built their counter-tactics around approach angles and altitudes and dawn light, none of which touched the actual problem, because not one of them ever suspected that the ammunition itself was awake. An entire nation spent its young men against a device it could not imagine. That is the secret. Not that the fuse was clever, that it stayed unknown for the length of a war while 22 million of them were built and fired in front of the men they were killing. Takejiro Onishi did not wait for the surrender to be signed. On the night of the 15th of August, 1945, hours after the Emperor's broadcast, he cut open his own abdomen in his quarters in Tokyo. His attempt at his throat failed. He was found the next morning, alive. He refused a second. He refused a doctor. He told the men who found him not to help him. He took roughly 15 hours to die, and he did it deliberately. As payment, he said, toward the debt he owed the pilots he had sent. His note thanked the souls of the special attackers, said he wished to atone for his part in the failure, and apologized to the dead flyers and their families. He put the number at about 4,000. He urged the young men who had survived to rebuild Japan and to work for peace between nations. He wrote that recklessness only aids the enemy. He never learned about the fuse. He went out believing his strategy had been beaten by American material superiority in the general sense, by numbers, by industry, which was true and which was not the truth. The truth was smaller and more specific than that. It was a 2-pound object in a nose cone, built by an astronomer who studied craters on the moon and a South Dakotan who had spent the 1920s measuring the height of the sky. Ugaki went the other way. On the 15th of August, after the broadcast, Matome Ugaki stripped the rank insignia from his uniform and walked out to the flight line. He had ordered aircraft prepared. More crews volunteered than he had airplanes for, and he took them anyway. He climbed into the back seat of a Suisse dive bomber, which meant he had displaced the man who was supposed to sit there. Even in this, at the very end, someone else was moved aside. They flew toward Okinawa in violation of the Emperor's surrender order. He radioed that he was diving on a target. The American ships off Okinawa recorded nothing. No attack, no damage, no casualties. That is the last Kamikaze mission. That is how it ends. Not with a dome of exploding steel, with an empty sea, and nobody noticing. Merle Tuve stayed at the Applied Physics Laboratory until 1946. He had watched its staff grow from 100 people to 800, and he had built its reputation as the place that did the impossible. Before he left, he quietly arranged funding to keep the best of his fuse scientists doing pure research. Work, weapon. And then he went back to the Carnegie Institution and spent the rest of his life studying the crust of the Earth and the origin of planets. He kept one of his own proximity fuses as a personal keepsake. Ralph Baldwin went back to the moon. He wrote the book that established that lunar craters were made by impacts and not volcanoes, ridiculed for years. Then simply what everyone knows. And decades later, he wrote the account of the fuse because he had noticed nobody remembered. Vannevar Bush wrote a report in 1945 arguing that the government should fund basic science forever in peacetime, with no application in view. That report built the National Science Foundation and the American Research University as we know it. He learned that from the fuse, because the fuse did not come out of a weapons program. It came from a man who spent the 1920s bouncing radio waves off the sky for no reason except that he wanted to know how high it was. And in the nose of every one of those shells, the same three questions ran over and over at the speed of light in the last fraction of a second of a young man's life. Send a signal. Listen for the echo. Ask how close.